Yeah, we're live. And 4 minutes ahead of schedule. See how we're looking here for our lighting. I'm gonna turn that down just a skosh. Nope. Maybe back up. Yeah, there we go. Now we're rocking it. Oh yeah, we're getting some bleed in there. That's pretty good. So tonight we're gonna talk about the thumbnail that I put up is basically a question. There's a lot of confusion about what actually works on camshafts, and one of the things that we've been taught over and over and over again is that your camshaft should not have any overlap. And so we're going to talk about that tonight, and I'm going to give you a few examples of camshafts. We're going to go ahead and plug them into a calculator basically that tells us how much overlap the camshaft has, and then you guys get to decide on whether or not you think that camshaft is going to work. 1 Liter Mafia is in the house. I'm hoping that is a Chevy Sprint Turbo reference, because that would be super awesome. Cheers to everybody. So the discussion for tonight is cam overlap, because for some reason this has been carried over through the years when people are discussing camshafts. And I understand kind of the basis for this, and people have been telling you, oh, you got to have for turbo applications, and really that's kind of carried over for blowers and stuff as well. You got to have a camshaft that doesn't have any overlap. That's why a lot of guys recommend the stock camshaft, because we know that there's no overlap on stock cams. In fact, some of the stock cams I've looked at have negative 32 degrees of overlap, which is, a ridiculous amount. It's so far removed from having overlap that it's a whole different kind of thing. And so that's why it's recommended that you run that kind of camshaft, these kind of mild cams that don't have overlap, because one, they tend to idle better and drive better and stuff, but also because and I remember going back 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, 30 years, reading old books and old magazine stories and stuff. And that was the consensus, is that you can't have overlap. And overlap, for the guys that don't understand what that are watching this, that's the period of time when the intake valve and the exhaust valve are both open at the same time. And so when they're both open, obviously things can happen. Things can flow from one side to the other, or the other side to the other, depending on what you're talking about. And so what they're worried about is, you've got boost there, so you have pressure in the inlet side. And if the inlet intake valve is open and the exhaust valve is open, all of that boost, instead of flowing into the combustion chamber like you'd want it to, and then creating power after the exhaust valve closes, and after obviously the intake valve closes as well, that it's just going to blow through there and go right out the exhaust. And that's the concern with overlap. And that's always been the discussion about it. That's always been the explanation, is why you can't have overlap. The reality is that that's not really what's happening. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that's not happening, and how actually overlapping your camshaft can be definitely not just not detrimental, but actually beneficial for what you're doing in your cam timing, and for what you're doing on a turbo application, even on a blower application. Because we've talked about this many times, that really every cam is a turbo cam. So even camshafts that have lots of overlap, as we'll see when we go through a couple of examples of cams that I use a lot, that it's definitely beneficial. The reason that it's beneficial, and I keep coming back to this, and because I'm trying to get people to think like this, is because it helps the NA power. And if it helps the NA power, it's going to help the boosted power. It's going to help with a roots blower. It's going to help with a centrifugal blower. It's going to help with nitrous. It's going to help with a turbo. It's going to help with all of that stuff. So we'll go over a few examples. And rather than thinking, oh no, I can't have overlap, I have to have a mild cam that has 0 degrees of overlap or negative overlap. Rather than think about that, the way that I want people to approach this is what does the camshaft do when the motor is NA? Because what are the things that I want the camshaft to do, mostly in terms of drivability and mileage. And then the other thing with a turbo that would be a big part of this is what is the boost response for the turbo application with this camshaft. So if you pick a big camshaft, let's say, that ostensibly has lots of overlap, those don't obviously go together, by the way, because you can have small cams that have more overlap than, relatively speaking, bigger cams. When I say small cams and big cams, I'm really talking about the intake duration. The exhaust duration to some extent too, but really the intake duration to me. For instance, a 210 cam is smaller than a 220 or a 230 cam. And so you can still have overlap on a 210 cam, depending on what you do with the other things. You can even have more than you have on the 230 cam, depending on what you do with that camshaft. So the overlap can be correlated, but it's not causal. Those two things don't have to go together. They can, but they don't have to. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at a couple of camshafts and we'll talk about how well they work on boosted applications. One of them being the sloppy stage 2 cam, because we already know that that's a turbo cam. Everyone has used it for turbo applications, and we know that it works well. What we know is that it works as a camshaft, like all the other camshafts. It's not the greatest cam. It's not some sort of secret thing. It's just a cam. If you put the sloppy stage 1 in, that would work too. If you could fit a sloppy stage 3 because you have valve reliefs, that would also work. Like I've shown before, all the truck cams, the Truck Norris cam, the best cam, all of the comp cams, all of the cam motion cams, Texas speed cams, all of those, they all work. They all work for boost. But so what you need to look at is more, you need to not be as concerned about overlap and whether it works with a turbo, and be more concerned with what is the cam doing? What are the things that the cam has to offer that I like? Does it idle well? What is the idle vacuum? Does it cruise? Does it work with the stock converter? When I'm driving down the road, does it buck and shudder because it doesn't like to run at that low engine speed? What is the torque curve like? Does it make good low speed torque? Does it make good mid range? Does it make top end? What is the cam size? And then when you're looking at that stuff, also, even with a turbo application, is that cam sized and combined properly with the other things on the motor? So do you have a camshaft that wants to be an 8,000 RPM camshaft and you have a stock truck manifold on it? If that's putting the stage 3-ish, 4-ish, 5-ish kind of cams in a 5.3, or even worse yet, a 4.8 with a truck manifold. You don't need that big of a cam. You don't even want that big of a cam on your 4.8 unless you were trying to, but even then, I was going to say, even if you're trying to rev it at 8,000 RPM with a rising boost curve, it's still not going to work well with that intake runner length. It's just, they're going to be like fighting each other. So short runners, lots of cam timing, lots of RPM, do that. And then so choose the cam that works with the intake manifold and hopefully head flow. And then the boost is just added to all that. So you have to choose the camshaft more than just for boost, and obviously more than just as a concern for overlap, because honestly, as we'll show, overlap, for a really good example of that is the comparison they did recently between the best cam and the Truck Norris cam, or the sloppy stage 2 is an even better example because it's bigger. The sloppy stage 2 cam and the Truck Norris cam, depending on what number Brian Dooley has for the exhaust duration, and I ran all of them. If you plug the numbers in, the Truck Norris cam has only slightly less to actually slightly more overlap than the best cam does. So, or than the sloppy stage 2 does, let's say. So one of them, but the thing is, even if it has as much, or even if it had slightly more overlap than the sloppy stage 2 cam, that doesn't mean that it doesn't work as a turbo cam, because we showed that already, that camshaft does something NA. It's smaller. It's a 212 versus a 228. Even though it has the same or possibly even more overlap, depending on what that last number is, even though it has that overlap figure, it makes more power down low NA, and it makes more power down low, which then improves boost response, which we showed with the turbo. So even with the overlap that we know that it has, it still makes for a really good turbo cam. And the other question that guys have for that is, yeah, but it has a really tight LSA and it's got overlap, and so it's not going to idle very well. Well, the other thing that they're not taking into account is the fact that that's a small cam. So like I said, it has overlap depending on where they put that exhaust duration number. It has overlap, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't idle better than another cam that's bigger, like that 469 cam that I run all the time from Comp Cams with a 231 duration and with the same amount or more overlap. That cam is bigger. It has more overlap. It's not going to idle as well on the same motor. But both of them have overlap. And so the thing that's nice is a lot of guys don't realize it is they think overlap makes the cam wild and makes it a high RPM cam, but it doesn't. Actually, by tightening up the LSA on that Truck Norris cam and having overlap, that's why they were able to have that thing make low speed power. And as we showed in that video, when you make low speed power, you improve turbo response. So that's a perfect example of having overlap, having it improve the NA power, and then that, by extension, improves the boost response and the turbo power. So, and we can show that with many different examples. In fact, I'll throw up the numbers on the, like we have the 469 cam is a 231, 247. It's 113 degree lobe separation angle. And then we'll do the calculations. It would be better if I had the exact opening and closing points. This gives me a fairly rough idea. But we're looking at that 231, 247 comp 54-469-11 camshaft has 13 degrees of overlap. And yet, I've run that camshaft not only with turbo applications, twin turbo applications in this case. I've also run that camshaft with twin turbo applications on small motors like a 5.3. And guess what? It works very well. I've run that with nitrous. I've run that with a centrifugal blower. I'm pretty sure that I have also run that with a roots blower or at least a twin screw blower, so a positive displacement blower of some kind. And guess what? All the boost doesn't bleed out the exhaust. It still makes good power. In fact, what a lot of guys will do, so I'll give you an idea. So we'll make this camshaft, we'll make this 54-469 comp cam that's 231, 247 with 113 degree lobe separation angle. Let's make it a blower cam. So we're going to make it, instead of 113 degree lobe separation angle, we're going to make it 120. So we're going to go from 13 degrees of overlap to -1 degree overlap. So all of a sudden now it has no overlap. It has -1 degrees just by changing the lobe separation angle. But what have we done to the camshaft? So it's typical for positive displacement camshafts to have wide lobe separation angles. And what they're doing with that, and we didn't change anything else. We didn't change the intake duration, didn't change the exhaust duration. This doesn't calculate it, but we didn't change lift on either one of them. All we did was change the lobe separation angle. And so what happens is this cam would tend to make power at a slightly higher engine speed, but it would also be much softer down low. So the reason that they do that for positive displacement blowers is that the positive displacement blower has an immediate boost response. As soon as you nail the throttle, you know, it's mechanically coupled to the motor. And not only that, because the centrifugal blower is also mechanically coupled to the motor, but it does make immediate boost, but it doesn't make as much as a positive displacement blower, because the thing that a positive displacement blower is spinning is much bigger. So the rotor pack in a typical positive displacement blower is much bigger, and it moves more air per revolution than the small impeller on a centrifugal blower. That's why a centrifugal blower makes 2 or 3 pounds down low and then makes 10 pounds or 12 pounds, whatever the peak number is, at maximum RPM. A positive displacement blower, a Kenny Bell or a Magnuson, a Kong, or an LSA blower, whatever, as soon as you get into the throttle, you'll have, you know, most of the boost that's going to be available. Some of those still have, especially the twin screw, would tend to have a slight rising curve depending on what your combination is. But they're going to have where, like if you nailed the throttle, let's say at 3,000 RPM in a typical LS application, and you had a centrifugal on there, that might be 2 or 2.5 pounds. On a positive displacement blower, depending on how you pull it, that could be, if you were making a peak of 15 pounds, that might be 10 or 11 pounds. So it's going to have a lot more boost down low. So when they do the camshaft for these, they tend to make the camshafts enhance power at the top of the RPM range. And that's what this wide LSA does. It also reduces overlap. But if we put the overlap back in and bring this thing back to 113 degrees, like it should be, and we have 13 degrees of overlap, what happens? Well, we might lose, and I've run this test before, we might lose a little bit of power at the very top. And when I say at the very top, a lot of that would depend on what kind of engine speed we're running and also what manifold we're using. If we're using a positive displacement blower that has a short runner manifold, it might, at the very top, it might like the wider lobe separation angle, honestly. But everywhere else in the curve, it's actually going to like having this overlap, because this overlap is going to make more power down low. And the other side benefit that's going to come from this on any kind of supercharge application is you're going to have a lower boost level because the motor's more efficient. The blower is spinning a fixed RPM. It's providing a fixed amount of airflow. Well, it's not technically providing a fixed amount of airflow because that's actually going to change a little bit when we change the camshaft, but it's providing a fixed blower speed. And so it wants to provide a given amount of boost, but we're using up a lot of that by making them more efficient. And so the boost actually comes down with the change in camshaft. It's not from valve events. It's not from the boost leaking out. It's because you've effectively made the blower, you've effectively made the motor much more efficient. So since it's more efficient, it's processing more air. It's processing more air now than it was with the other camshaft. And so now the blower is still spinning the same, but it's using more. So the boost goes down, which is nothing but a good thing. So let's take a look at our, for instance, the sloppy stage 2 cam. So that's a 228, 230. And then I think that's on a 112. So the sloppy stage 2 still has 5 degrees of overlap, which is, and we talked about that in comparison to the truck Norris cam, which it could have that much. It could have a little bit more. It could have a little bit less, but it's going to be close to that. They have the same overlap, and yet they're decidedly different cams, not because of the overlap value, which could be similar, but because one of them is a 212 cam and the other one's a 228 cam. So as we saw in the video that I did, in the testing NA, one of them, the bigger cam, the 228 cam, makes more power at a higher engine speed, and one of them makes more power at a lower engine speed. That's typical of the camshaft. And despite the fact that they have a similar amount of overlap, the one that makes more low speed power also does that under boost, improves boost response, makes more power. And then the one that makes more power on the top still makes more power on the top at any given boost level. So it's very important to understand this about camshafts. And what I hope that you take away from this is that you don't think that overlap is your enemy, because actually it's not. A lot of times it's very beneficial because it helps make more power. And it especially helps make more power in the usable range that most motors run, meaning from whatever your torque converter rate thing is, like 2000 RPM to 6500 RPM. Having something that has 120 degree lobe separation angle is going to be much softer. If you had the other intake and exhaust duration numbers, it's going to be much softer than something that had 113 or 112, or push it all the way back and go to 105 or 106, assuming that you had enough piston to valve clearance for that kind of thing. But that tends to improve power production in that range. But at some point, there is going to be a trade-off at the top. And we've seen that with some of the wide LSA stuff, especially on the supercharge applications, not because one of them is a better supercharged cam. It's just that the cam is tailored to work in one RPM range better than the other. The other thing to mention here is, and you have to mention this because it's very important. It's part of the bigger picture when we're choosing camshafts, and that's this. That's that when we tighten up that lobe separation angle, when we start having, especially with a smaller cam, when we start having more overlap, it improves power, but it also can reduce idle quality. So as you get tighter on the LSA and you start like I said, especially with the smaller cams, if you start having more overlap, you get beneficial gains from power, but you can start losing idle quality. And for some guys, that's not a big deal, especially for race applications. But you'd want to balance that. Like I said, when you're choosing a camshaft and you're looking at that, you're like, look, I don't want to have to put a big stall converter in it. I want the thing to idle. I don't want to have to worry about the thing stalling when I drive through a drive-through and I'm getting my biggie fries. So all of that would be a consideration. But when you're looking at having a turbo motor, don't worry about overlap. Overlap can be your friend as long as the camshaft is doing what you want it to do. NA, it will also do what you want it to do under boost. So let's see what you guys got going on. Shots fired. What effect does lobe separation have on emissions for streetcar crowd? I don't know. I would tend to think that the wider LSA stuff that they run in production vehicles tend to maybe reduce that to improve emissions. I just saw a shop pull apart a 4L60E, I'm sure, with 350,000 miles on it. I never opened it up. Nice. So essentially, we can perfectly, for efficiency, use a turbo cam with a centrifugal blower. I think you'd be better off using an NA cam for both of those, but that's just me. Opinion on Tick Performance Stage 2 boost cam and a 408 stroker, 10.5 to 1 T6 VS Racing 85mm billet turbo. I don't know I don't know the Tick stuff off the top of my head. You just have to tell me what the intake and exhaust duration and the LSA are, and I could give you a fairly good idea. Where's the poll? That's right. It's time for the poll, right? That's right. Okay, so I've already done my spiel on cam timing here. Do you need to, this should be so simple. Do you need to avoid overlap on a, do you need to avoid overlap on a turbo cam? After the discussion, let's see what everybody thinks. Is a 229, 244, 630, 615 too small for a 416 stroker? It depends on what you're trying to do. I get leery on some of the lift figures, especially with that low of a duration. So I start worrying about like stability. Johnny, how about a 224, 230? That's kind of a good cam. I like that range of camshaft. Obviously, the 5-liter Ford is good. That kind of camshaft would have, I think I did the 224, 232 cam. 224, 230, and was that a 112? I think it was, right? Yeah. So your 224, 230, I'm making some assumptions here. It has about 3 degrees of overlap on it. Yeah. Every cam is a turbo cam. They all are. Bought an LQ9 today. Nice. Looking to cam it with 7875. There's lots of good camshafts for that. Again, choose the camshaft not because it's a turbo application, not because it's a 1,000 horsepower combination or potential with that turbo. Choose the camshaft for what you want it to do in all other aspects. it will make power. Any sort of cam in a 6-liter LS is going to make good power, especially with that turbo on it. So pick the camshaft to do the other things that you want to do. With the sloppy stage 2 making more horsepower and torque than a stock one in a 6-liter, with a truck Norris cam make a ton more torque than stock in a 6-liter. Yes, the truck Norris cam, if you look at the results of the, I think I showed you in the comparison of the NA testing, I showed you what the truck Norris cam does versus a stock cam on a 5.3, and we would see that on a 6-liter too. That camshaft will be better everywhere than a stock cam on a 6-liter. Just check if you're still on track. How's the 396 coming? I don't know. I'm really not in charge of that. I'm waiting for Bostic to get it done for me. Richard's testing said that the best cam and the truck Norris cam are close. The truck Norris or the best cam made a little bit more peak power and less down low than the truck Norris cam. Again, one of those cams is bigger and one of those cams is smaller. And so it does what a bigger cam does and what a smaller cam does. Marley, 231, 243, 618, 617, 115 plus 5, and a 6.2, 821 heads, twin 70mm turbos. Yeah, that will make good power. It will do whatever those turbos will do. That's enough camshaft. You don't even have to have that much cam to top two 70mm turbos out. If you're not confused here, then you really don't know what's going on. Why would you be confused? Amos, I got a Duramax intercooler set into my 2001 8.1 truck. Nice, pretty much a bolting. That's cool. Just dropped in and say hello. Thank you very much. Best cam for an LQ4 and a heavy truck. No other mods. I would kind of go with the truck Norris cam if it's on a 6-liter. About 3 days away from my new short block coming in. 5.8 liter with a 603, 239, 246. Can't wait to push this. Is it a 351? That's a big camshaft. How important is screw blower intake plenum floor design for street applications, center divider, etc.? Are you talking about like a Kenny Bell or Whippler or something? Building a 2JZ with an 87mm diamond pistons plus 1 valve size, ported head, 276 cams, 2150 injector. So you're obviously planning on making some power. First import build, 283 in my 65 was a breeze. The Supra is a lot. I mean, but it can make a lot of power. So Braden, your cam has 360 degrees of overlap. That'll be just fine. Cam recommendation for a 2.3 Whipple 5.3 truck. I have Whipple blower videos up on the channel, so you can kind of see what we did. I think the one that I ran was on a 5.3 or on a 4.8 though. But I think it was bigger than that. I think that it was a 2.9. Is a tune mandatory for a truck Norris cam? Yes, almost for any kind of camshaft that's going to add that kind of power, it's going to require retuning it. Have you ever tested the effects of an 8-into-1 header? I've never run one of those. They have some off-road stuff that have 8-into-1 headers going into on the chassis dyno side at Westech, but I've never tested one on the engine dyno. I'm honestly not sure why it would increase spool versus regular headers. I don't know if there's something to the pulsing from 8 versus 4 and then 2, and then, I mean, all the exhaust is going to the same place. So I would like to see that tested, but I don't know if that's the case. Justin, I just put a Summit Stage 2 cam, 218, 227, and a 4.8 Silverado, long tubes, 2800 stall. It drives great and has tons more power everywhere, tuned, of course. I'm surprised that you didn't lose low speed power with a 218 cam in a 4.8. But did you? Oh, you have a 2800 stall. Okay, that would make sense. Isaiah worked for TSP, sold thousands of cams over the years. I just try to spec for the vehicle, engine, and converter. That makes sense. Overlap allows the vacuum signal from the exiting exhaust gas to pull in additional air from the intake side. This causes a supercharging effect, increases volumetric efficiency. That's not exactly how it works. Scavenging comes from changes in a couple of things. There are, like the intake, I think that there are 3 primary forms of charge filling associated with the exhaust design as well. One of them is scavenging from primary length. The other one is vacuum created from the exhaust signal going faster than the exhaust gases. If I remember, I'm gonna have to look that one back up. I'm not as fluent on exhaust side as I am on intake side. But just the fact that the exhaust is going out, and actually during overlap, there's not a lot of flow effect going on at that point. So it'd have to be a pressure wave scavenging. When you have both valves open at the same time, the boost helps push fuel all the way out through the exhaust. So when the exhaust valve closes, it helps catch fuel and oxygen inside. Actually, that's not accurate. And this is one of the things that I was starting to discuss when we were talking about overlap with the camshafts. It's a common misconception that during overlap, when the intake and the exhaust valve are both open, if you have overlap in your camshaft, that on a turbo application, that the positive pressure that you have on the intake side is blowing out through, because the intake valve is open, blowing out through the intake valve and then out the exhaust valve, because the exhaust valve is also open. So rather than going in and filling the cylinder and then, having that compress and make power, it's all blowing out. That's a common misconception on turbo applications. The reason that doesn't happen is because what do we have usually on the exhaust side of a turbo? We also have back pressure. And more often than not, we have more back pressure than boost pressure. So when both of those are open, if you have more on one side and less on the other, what is going to be the direction of flow? That's a way simplistic, because how fast this is all happening, that's a way simplistic thing. The reality is that this happens so fast that there's not time for that, what people are talking about, to happen anyway, I don't think. But if something was happening like that, then it would flow in the other direction. The other thing is, you don't have that on a supercharge application. On a supercharge application, you have positive pressure on the inlet side, but no pressure on the back side, because there's no pressure between the exhaust and the exhaust valve and the turbo. You don't have back pressure there. So if something were to happen and you'd have this blow through where you're blowing the pressurized air out the exhaust, it would be much more likely to happen on a supercharged application. But again, when we do actual testing with camshafts that have overlap and they improve the power NA, they also do a very similar thing under boost. 5.3 sloppy stage 2 cam, 7 to 6 head, 78, 75, single turbo, running 85, trying to prick the correct size injectors. You're going to need something big, thousands or 1500s. 80s won't be enough unless you're just trying to run not very much boost. Because with the 85, you have the NA power, and then you have the boosted power, and then you have the the E85 power, which all require a lot of fuel flow. So 80s will get you fairly far, but you might as well put 1500s in it. Sound wave scavenging. The pressure waves travel at the speed of sound. Have you ever blown up a turbo when the charge pipe blows off at max RPM, freewheeling, no boost? I've never heard a turbo. We've blown off charge pipes a lot, but I've never had it injure the turbo. We have damaged a turbo, but it was on the first load in, and I think that the turbo was just bad, and it just seized up. That's the only time I've ever hurt one. A 252, 252 at 50 cam, that's a lot. And you have that in a 2.4 liter K24, 109 LSA. Not sure it's going to idle below. Do you need that much camshaft? What are you trying to do with that? That seems like an awful lot of camshaft for a 2.4 liter. Would I need a tune for long tubes? You might not need it for that. You're probably, I don't know if it's a mass air car, it might add that already. You're going to make a little bit more power with long tubes, and you'll have to have the fuel for it, but it might self-compensate for that. Pressure waves travel at the speed of sound. The speed of sound changes on the density of the gas. Yes, all that's true. But if you look at the change in the speed of the sound wave with varying pressures, the only side you're going to get a really big change in temperature is on the exhaust side. You can't really change the inlet side very much to make an appreciable change in the speed of the wave. That's why when we run a boosted application, the reflected waves on the inlet side, the motor still makes power at roughly the same RPM range. The intake manifold still is effective in the same RPM range, whether it's NA or under boost, because you can't really change that. Even though, let's say we've added 200 degrees, that's almost nothing. On the exhaust side, if you add 1500 degrees, obviously maybe a bigger change there. Okay, it's for circuit racing, 15 millimeter ITV. Okay, so it's all set up. How would the Bald Eagle boost cam do on a 408 stroker? You don't, for an 85 millimeter turbo, you don't need a really big camshaft. You can max out an 85 millimeter turbo with a truck Norris cam if you wanted to do that. I wouldn't recommend that camshaft on a 408, but you don't need a very big camshaft for that. Jim, happy to help. The Bald Eagle cam is a 227, 232. You'd be able to top that turbo out with that camshaft. That wouldn't be a problem at all. And it probably would drive around pretty nice on a 10-to-1 408. Todd's in the house. I got to go up and see him today. I ain't no punk. Even after my discussion, do you need to avoid overlap on a turbo cam? 79% and saying no, and 21 are still clinging to the yes that you need to. I've always used 60 degrees Fahrenheit for inlet air temperatures on an NA applications to do my calculate. What are you doing calculations on? What are you trying to figure out? Yeah, everybody say hi to Punk. He's in the house. OBS with 6.2 liter with a Magnuson, least amount of changes for best performance and economy. I don't even understand what your question is. Are you wanting a camshaft? Are you wanting cylinder heads? Are you wanting more boost? Are you wanting to run E85? A 6.2 with a Magnuson is not the choice that you'd make for maximum economy. So maybe I don't understand what you're trying to do. Would you keep 317 heads on an LQ4 Truck Norris camera? Swap them? Again, it depends. That's up to you. It depends on what you're trying to do. They will work. And then if you put a turbo on them, they would work even better. But if you want more power, there are better heads for that. A set of rec port heads with a rec port intake manifold would pick up a lot of power. Tyler, we all need to get into yoga. Is that what you're saying? Do you recommend more or less ring gap on aluminum block compared to an iron block for boosted applications? I recommend the same. It's based on ring temperature. Looking to get the truck nurse installed and boosted at 7 pounds on the 85. That'll work good. First at 7, then 8 would be okay. 10. We're right near 10. We might as well do 10, and then 15. So we're at 79% and saying no, that you don't need to avoid overlap, and then 21% still saying yes, so we need to avoid overlap. When was the last time you cracked a block for making too much power? I've never hurt a block, and I've never hurt a crankshaft, whether it's a cast one and on the block side, whether it's an iron one or an aluminum one. I haven't ever done that just from power. In fact, I haven't had anybody show me one that they hurt just from power. I've had people tell me that that's what it was, but that's a different thing than it actually being that. Yeah, people were talking about yoga. If you go do it and go all in on a class like that, your first time, you're going to be sore. How do you feel about bolting a 125 horsepower nitrous kit? Should I just run race gas in the main tank to make it safe? For the NA tune, that will be in my truck, so I don't need a nitrous tune. You can do that. Otherwise, are you thinking about running a separate tank and just running the nitrous fuel feed line to the nitrous setup with race gas? Because guys do that too. I myself would feel better having, if I'm going to run 125 shots, especially if I'm going to the track, just put a little bit of good gas in, or at least throw some octane booster or something in it, just sometimes just to make me feel better. A 125 shot, I've run those a lot on pump gas. If you said the VTEC crossover when it starts making power, not when the turbo hits, on a street application, you would want the turbo to be making boost long before the VTEC crossover point. You'd want it to be doing that on the primary cam. Lucas, can I run 8-to-1 compression NA setup for a month until turbo shows up? Yes, you can run any compression you want. Why do some cams have a lot more exhaust duration than the intake duration? most dual pattern cams are going to be like that. Sometimes they're single pattern cams, and then we've talked about before, some of them are reverse pattern cams where they have less exhaust duration, but that's typical. And the explanation that most people give is that because the intake flows so much more than the exhaust, we have more exhaust duration to help that like imbalance of flow between those two. I think that there's more to it than that, but are Nippon LS pistons any good? I don't think that I've ever tried them. Can you show idle in videos? I'm less worried about making 1,000 horsepower versus a good sounding idle chop. An idle chop is something you can do with a tune. You don't even really need a camshaft to do that. But yeah, I can show idle clips. How about feeding the turbocharger after a single pipe coming from both exhaust manifolds on a big block Chevy? Would that work? I'm having a hard time picturing what you're asking there. Are you running the exhaust from both exhaust manifolds into a turbo? Because that's what a turbo setup is. Are you talking about running one port of, so essentially 2 ports of an 8-cylinder, one from each side, into it to make a turbo work? That won't work unless the turbo is really, really small. It doesn't get enough exhaust. So I hope that one of those two is the question that you were asking. David, is an LS9 cam good for a truck with a supercharger stock motor? No, it's not. I don't know what supercharger it is, but there are lots better than that. If that's free and you already have it and it's a cam, it will work. but it's soft down low and better way up at the very top. And if that's what you want for truck applications, most truck guys spend most of their time in an RPM range, even with a blower on it, where that camshaft is not going to be great. Should I run 862 heads on a 6-liter or look for another set of heads? We'll be putting a GT45 when the block is assembled. It doesn't matter which head you run on the 6-liter. If you're putting a GT45 on it, that's going to be limiting the power output of that combination anyway. That's going to be a 700 or 750 horsepower turbo, and we'll do it with any factory LS head that you pick. On a turbo cam, a little bit of overlap is good to get the exhaust out. It's good on all engines. Most factory cams don't have overlap. In fact, I don't know any of them that do. Most mild cams don't have any overlap. Aeromotive or A1000 are larger for Todd, depending on your needs for horsepower. Mike, better late than never. Ellis with boost, any head you have the head is irrelevant. Yeah. Mike, I have great news. I got the permit to build a shop out back so I can get back to work on the wagon in 3 or 4 months. Nice. Except for max efforts. Yeah, we're talking about the 95% rule where people are just putting stuff together and putting turbos on it. If you're trying to do, drag week stuff or no prep or whatever, you're going to build a different kind of motor. That's going to be a different thing. Nick, we went over what my thoughts on overlap and turbos are. The turbo doesn't care about overlap. The perfect example is the Truck Norris cam and the Sloppy Stage 2 cam that I just ran. Both those camshafts have overlap. In fact, depending on where they put that, they can be very similar in the amount of overlap that they have. They're still different cams because one of them is bigger than the other one. And not surprisingly, the bigger cam makes more peak power and the smaller cam makes less peak power, makes more low speed power. And they do that under boost. The overlap doesn't come into that part of the equation. The cam does what the cam does. And then it also does that under boost, not surprisingly. I've ever seen a turbo flathead Ford V8. I've seen a supercharged one, but not a turbo one though. If I keep my finger off the plus button for the turbo boost, I'm looking for 750 wheel horsepower. That won't be a trouble with the turbo that you have. Braden, we've run wet nitrous, single fogger deals with running the fuel, joining the fuel and the nitrous together in one fogger nozzle mounted in front of the throttle body. We've run that. I'm sure I've run them 100 times and it works good. You don't want to go too big on those with EFI, the long runner factory style LS manifolds, because they're really long runner and stuff doesn't find its way. Mostly the fuel, the nitrous seems to do that fairly well. In fact, I was talking to Brian Tooley about that, and one of the things that they used to do on a car that they ran, and it's pretty common, is it if you just inject the nitrous into the intake manifold, it does a lot better because it's kind of gaseous and finds its home better. And then you add the fuel through the injectors and through the tuning, and that can work well. And I think ultimately you could run more power with nitrous using that kind of setup than you could with just trying to run the fuel and the nitrous in front of the intake manifold. On rotors and running turbos, you run as much exhaust overlap as possible. And again, that's the thing. What you did, does it make more power NA? And if it does, then it's going to be good for the turbo. What's the max safe RPM you would spin a stock bottom end Gen 3 5.3 at, in your opinion? Do you have a combination that's going to make power up at that really high RPM range? We go to 7,500 on junkyard motors pretty regularly. What was Tyler's question? Are there any cams for a 5.7 liter Toyota? I don't know about the Toyota market, but there are people that can regrind almost anything. The RPM that you're reading is crank RPM, and the camshaft spins half of that. Richard, stock exhaust with a turbo after the pipes going into a single pipe, just like old vehicles with a single exhaust. Yeah, that's all that a turbo kit is. If you run the exhaust, merge them together into a single tube, and put the turbo on the single tube, that's what a turbo kit is. And we've used those stock Y pipes from trucks usually, and they work fine. As long as you get all the exhaust to the turbo, it will be a turbo kit. What do you gap rings for in a 6.0 with boost? 28 to 30 usually, because we're almost always going to go up in boost. But our ported TBS manifolds worth it? I've never run a ported factory manifold. He's talking about after the mufflers. You can rear mount turbos as well after the exhaust all the way back in the back if you want, but it's going to be a little bit softer on spool up. Which spark plug brand, temperature, and gap do you run? The gap is usually 18 or 19 if we're running lots of boost. An NGK we use. They also, Westech has some Denso stuff and some Champion race plugs. They've got a variety of different things. It just depends on what we have that's convenient. Have you done any 32 valve 5.7 pulls on the dyno? Are you talking about an import version of that motor, or are you talking about the LT5 motor, the ZR1 motor? I haven't run the ZR1 motor. Westec has one, but we haven't run it yet. $7,000 per inch of bore. That would be a lot of gap. I like E3s. We have run some of those on stock motors, but I wouldn't use them on any kind of performance deal. Yeah, 7,000. 7,000 would be a lot. Maximum boost. Are you talking about Corky Bell's book, or are you just throwing that out there? Oh, 5.7 iForce Toyota. I have not run a Toyota or a Nissan or any of the import V8s on the dyno. Have you ever run a twin turbo setup, but not sequential off both banks at the same time? Not the typical one turbo per bank. So I don't know what you're asking. You're saying not sequential off of both banks at the same time. So you want me to run exhaust into a Y pipe and then go from that Y pipe into two turbos? I mean, that's just splitting hairs, really. Have you seen any of the import V8s at the wrecking yard? Yeah, there's lots of them there. Well, and lots of them. I have seen them. And a sequential off both, running off of both banks is not sequential. It's just a twin turbo setup. If you run one turbo off of each bank, that's just a twin turbo setup. A sequential would be that you're running one smaller turbo and then a bigger turbo, and you're having most or all of the exhaust go to the small one first. And then after that one spools up, you bleed over and have some of it go to the bigger turbo. And then when the bigger turbo spools up, you shut another valve that stops the bigger turbo from backfeeding the inlet flow, the boost, back through the smaller turbo. It's pretty evolved. The setup is a sequential is. Richard, back in the day, Super Ford magazine quoted Jack Roush stating the Cleveland Head and Pro Stock program made almost 900 horsepower and is the baddest, most powerful engine cubic inch ever produced. Are you wanting to say that the Cleveland is the best engine ever? Because that's not going to go very far. The Cleveland did what the Cleveland did. And a Cleveland head, no Cleveland head that I know supports that kind of power. And unless they wildly modified it. It was a good motor and it won a lot of stuff, but the most powerful engine per cubic inch ever produced. It had of all of the small blocks, up until modern times, like the LS stuff and the LT stuff, which is not even close. It's way better than the Cleveland stuff, but the Cleveland head for a small block was certainly the highest flowing small block head that I know of. And it made the 351, Boss 351, made the most power of all of the factory small blocks that I put together and tested. So it was definitely that. The thing that you're saying seems like a lot. I get better mileage with my E3s. Okay. I would like to see a small turbo, then big turbo transition setup. Take a look at the Supra was like that, and also the RX-7, the Gen 3 RX-7, which I really want one of those, was like that as well. Just talked to Rich, and we're pulling the front clip off of the black truck and kicking off the LS install. Nice. I haven't seen. We've tried a few different kinds of plugs and stuff, and we've done. And the guys at West Tech, Brule, and those guys have done it too. Have done plug tests where they've tested different styles of plugs. You know, the fancy split V and the 3-prong and the whatever side gap deal. And if the motor wasn't misfiring, they haven't seen changes in power that they were able to register in their kind of testing. With different spark plugs. If you have misfire and you cure misfire, you can get power from that. But one initiating a specially supercharged type of flame kernel, like all of the marketing stuff, I just haven't seen that. Porsche 959 twin turbo sequential, yes, another good one. I've seen one of those up close. There was one of those at the Silver State one year. I don't know why you continue to go on with the Matt Happel thing. I think everybody here is a fan of Matt. I certainly am. I watch this stuff all the time. The Nova is going down this month to get running. That's why Top Fuel uses E3 plugs. That's why Top Fuel is sponsored by E3 plugs. Should I replace valves and springs in my LQ4 and swapping the cam? You should definitely put springs in it. The valves I wouldn't worry about. Tyler, you're leaving 15. Were you leaving 2 minutes ago? Because that's what I usually do, is 2 minutes ago. Todd, on the blow-off valve, you can plumb it back in. They normally do that on mass air cars. So if you're running a mass air, since you're running a speed density, it can just go to atmosphere. I don't think Matt was the first one to run 8s on a Junkyard 4.8. I don't think he was even close to being the first one. How does Lash affect valve lift on a solid lift or camshaft? The more Lash you have, the less lift you have. Supposedly, the 8-into-1 headers provide a more constant pressure supply instead of the intermittent pulses. Richard, yours will be the last one because I got to get going. Hey, Richard, so we'll close out the Richard. I'm dead in the water with my M122 supercharger since no adapters are available from Mac Daddy. So what's the largest turbocharger I can run on a 4.8 liter GM motor? Well, you can run as big a turbo as you think that your motor will handle, but just you can pick a turbo that would easily make a lot more power than the M122 Supercharger. And there is somebody that has a manifold and adapter for that blower. Tom DeMuse, send me an email. I'll put my email down here. Let me close out this thing, which is really surprising. Do we need to avoid overlap on turbo cam? Still 28% saying yes, even after my whole spiel. So we'll close that out. I'm going to put my email address. Send me an email, and I'll get you in touch with Tom, who sent me the intake manifold to mount those blowers on an LS. So you can actually make that work if that's what you want to do. You'll make more power with a turbo, but if you want the blower on there, that will also work. How about if I put my 16 at AOL.com. The other thing I'm going to be doing before I say goodbye is I'm probably going to be doing another live feed in the morning. Obviously, everybody can't make it at the same time, so I'm going to try to broaden that up and help more people in the morning. And I might also do something early. It might be something early in the morning. So basically, I could get on here and just yell at people to go get their projects done. So if you want to wake up in the morning and have somebody berate you about getting your project done, that's probably going to be me. So I'm thinking about doing that. And don't worry, I'm going to be yelling at myself too, because obviously I have projects that are not done as well. And that's where this all came about. So that could be kind of fun. And it will be this kind of talk where we go into technical discussions on various things. So that will be interesting. Just a different group, and maybe the same, but it will be, I'm just trying to reach out to other people too that can't get here all the time, because this is late in a lot of places. It's earlier in a lot of places. So just trying to expand it out a little bit. Thank you guys for showing up. And I'll get a video up tomorrow. It'll be the 500 horsepower versions of all the big block stuff. We're going to continue along that line, 5, 6, 7, 800, 900, up to 1,000 horsepower on the big block combinations. I will see you guys all tomorrow.